Political and economic change. Not surprisingly, with Iran's long, complex history, political and economic change has taken many forms, including both evolution and revolution. Politically, Persia established itself as the first large empire in world history, a military powerhouse with strong leaders and centralized governing structures. Despite the continuity of religious and political union, a gradual separation of religion from politics resulted in the declining centralization of political power over time before the 20th century. The 20th century saw two revolutions, one in 1905 to 1909 that set democratic impulses in place, and one in 1979 that reunified religion with politics in the modern theocracy. Economically, Iran has both suffered and benefited from natural resources. A lack of arable land has meant that the agricultural basis of the empires was never secure, and the geographical location also caused Iran to emphasize trade by land. When world commerce turned to sea-based powers beginning in the 16th century, Iran was marginalized, although Iran maintained its independence during the age of European imperialism. It did not prosper until its greatest modern natural resource was discovered. However, oil has brought its own set of economic problems to Iran, that of managing this necessary commodity for industrialization in such a way that it benefits not only the state, but its people as well. We will follow political and economic change through four eras: the Safavids, 1501 to 1722, the Qajars, 1794 to 1925, the Pahlavis, 1925 to 1979, and the Islamic Revolution and Republic, 1979 to the present. The Safavids, 1501 to 1722. As discussed in the previous section, modern Iran traces its Shiite identity to the Safavid Empire that began in the 16th century. By the mid-17th century, the Safavids had succeeded in converting nearly 90% of their subjects to Shi'ism. Sunniism has survived to modern day among ethnic groups along the borders: Kurds in the northwest, Turkmen in the northeast, Baluchis in the southeast, and Arabs in the southwest. Despite their religious fervor, the Safavids tolerated the Sunnis, as well as a smaller number of Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians. They shared with other Muslim rulers a special regard for people of the book, monotheistic people who subjected their lives to holy books similar to the Quran. They respected all these religions because they had their own books: Jews, the Torah; Christians, the Bible; and Zoroastrians, the Avesta. The Safavids ruled from Isfahan, a Persian-speaking city, and most of their bureaucrats were Persian scribes. However, the Safavids had serious economic constraints. Trade routes from Iran to the ancient Silk Route had broken up, and the world trade had shifted to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Isfahan was far inland with little access to sea-based trade, and agricultural production was hampered by a lack of arable land. These economic problems affected the Safavids' ability to rule, since they did not have money for a large bureaucracy or a standing army. As a result, they had to rely largely on local rulers to keep order and collect taxes. In theory, the Safavids claimed absolute power, but in reality, they lacked a central state, and had to seek the cooperation of semi-independent local leaders. Geographic features fragmented the empire, particularly the mountains, and many clerics lived safely outside the reach of the government. As a result of both political and economic factors, the monarchy became separated from society and lost a great deal of its power by 1722. The Qajars, 1794 to 1925. The Safavid Empire ended with when Afghan tribesmen invaded Isfahan in 1722. Iran was in disarray for more than a half-century, until the land was finally conquered by another Turkish group, the Qajars. The Qajars moved the capital to Tehran, and they retained Shi'ism as the official state religion. However, the Qajar rule marked an important political change. Whereas the Safavids claimed to be descendants of the 12 imams, the Qajars obviously could not tie their legitimacy to such a link. As a result, the Shia clerical leaders could claim to be the main interpreters of Islam, and the separation between government and religion widened significantly. Economically and politically, Iran's power eclipsed during the 19th century. The Qajars ruled during the era of European imperialism, and they suffered land losses due to the north and the northwest to the growing power of Russia. They sold oil drilling rights in the southwest to Britain, and they borrowed heavily from European banks to meet their considerable court expenses. By the end of the 19th century, the Shah had led the country into serious debt, and many Iranians were upset by his lavish lifestyle. These problems encouraged the Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1909. The revolution began with business owners and bankers demonstrating against the Qajars' move to hand over their customs collections to Europeans. Although the Qajars were attempting to settle their debts, middle-class people were fed up, particularly because they suspected that the Shah would sacrifice paying domestic debts in order to repay European loans. In 1906, the merchants and local industrialists, affected by British liberalism, demanded a written constitution from the Shah. The British, who had many business interests in Iran, encouraged the Shah to concede, particularly since Iran did not have an army to effectively put down an insurrection. The Constitution of 1906 was modeled after Western ones and included such democratic features as direct elections, separation of powers, laws made by an elected legislature, popular sovereignty, a Bill of Rights guaranteeing citizens equality before the law, protections for those accused of crimes, and freedom of expression. The revolution sparked a debate about separation of religion from the government, the trend that the Qajars themselves had initiated. The constitution retained the monarchy, but it created a strong legislature to balance executive power. The new assembly was called the Majlis, and seats were guaranteed to the people of the book, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. The Majlis not only had the authority to make and pass laws, but it also controlled cabinet ministers who reported to the legislature, not the Shah. The Constitution of 1906 did not turn away from Shi'ism completely. Shi'ism was declared the official state religion, and only Shiites could hold cabinet positions. The Constitution also created a guardian council of clerics that had the power to veto any legislation passed by the Majlis. These political reforms could do nothing, however, for Iran's economic woes. World events of the early 20th century led to Iran's division into three parts, with one piece for themselves, but another piece occupied by Russia, and another by Britain during World War I. By 1921, Iran was in political and economic disarray, with quarreling factions polarizing the Majlis into an ineffective ruling body. The country was ready for a strong leader to deliver them from complete chaos. The Pahlavis, 1925 to 1979. The Cossack Brigade had been one of the few areas of strength in the latter days of the Qajars, since it was the only force that resembled a real army. The brigade's commander, Colonel Reza Khan, carried out a successful coup d'etat against the weakened political state in 1921, and declared himself Shah-in-Shah in 1925, establishing his own Pahlavi dynasty, using a name of an ancient language from Iran's glorious past. Under Reza Shah, the Majlis lost its power, and authoritarian rule was re-established in Iran. He ruled with absolute authority until he turned over power to his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, in 1941. Despite the fact that the Pahlavis re-established order in Iran, democratic experimentation resulting from the Constitution of 1906 was not forgotten, and the second Shah had to confront some democratic opposition. One group that challenged the Shah was the Communist Tuda Masses Party, that gained most of its support from working class and trade unions. A second group was the National Front, led by Mohammad Mossadegh, whose life influenced many later political leaders in Iran. The National Front drew its support from middle-class people who emphasized Iranian nationalism. Mossadegh advocated nationalizing the British-owned company that monopolized Iran's oil business, and he also wanted to take the armed forces out from under the Shah's control. Mossadegh was elected prime minister in 1951, and his power grew so that the Shah was forced to flee the country in 1953. Mossadegh's career was cut short when the British struck back by co-sponsoring with the U.S. an overthrow of Mossadegh, and restoring the Shah to full power again. The U.S., ever mindful of keeping Soviet power contained in these Cold War days, was motivated to reinstall the Shah as a pro-Western force in the Middle East. As a result, many Iranians came to see Britain and the U.S. as supporters of autocracy, and the Shah was as a weak pawn of foreign powers. Economically, Iran was transformed into a rentier state under the Pahlavis because of the increasing amount of income coming in from oil. A rentier economy is heavily supported by state expenditure, while the state receives rent from other countries. Iran received an increasing amount of income by exporting its oil and leasing oil fields to foreign countries. The income became so great that by the 1970s, the government no longer had to rely on internal taxes for its support, but paid most of its expenses through oil income. In short, the government didn't need the people anymore. Iran was quickly transformed into a one-product economy and was heavily dependent on oil to keep the government afloat. Even though the Shah adopted import substitution industrialization by encouraging domestic industries to provide products that the population needed, by 1979, oil and its associated industries made up a large percentage of Iran's GNP and provided 97% of the country's foreign exchange. The White Revolution. During their rule, the two Pahlavi Shahs built a highly centralized state, the first since the ancient days of the Persian Empire. The state controlled banks, the national radio-television network, and most importantly, the National Iranian Oil Company. The armed forces grew into the fifth largest army in the world by 1979, and came to include a large navy and air force as well. The central bureaucracy gained control of the local governments, and the Majlis became a rubber-stamped legislature that let the Shah rule as he pleased. Whereas Iran remained a religious state, its courts became fully secularized, with a European-style judicial system and law codes in place. Most controversial of all was the Shah's White Revolution, so named because it was meant to counter communist or red influences, that focused on the land reform, with the government buying land from large absentee owners and selling it to small farmers at affordable prices. The purpose was to encourage farmers to become modern entrepreneurs with irrigation canals, dams, and tractors. The White Revolution secularized Iran further by extending voting rights to women, restricting polygamy, and allowing women to work outside the home. Patronage and the Resurgence Party. Both Pahlavi Shahs bolstered their own personal wealth, first by seizing other people's property, and eventually through establishing the tax-exempt Pahlavi Foundation, a patronage system that controlled large companies that fed the pocketbooks of the Shah and his supporters. In 1975, Mohammad Reza Shah announced the formation of the Resurgence Party and declared Iran to be a one-party state with him at its head. He replaced the Islamic calendar with a new one and adopted two new titles, Guide to the New Great Civilization and Light of the Aryans. The Shah also dared to create a religious corps, whose duty it was to teach Iranian peasants true Islam. The Islamic Revolution and the Republic, 1979 to the present. Great revolutions have shaken the world in many places since the late 18th century, and the causes and consequences of Iran's 1979 revolution are in some ways very similar to those in Russia, China, and Mexico in the 20th century. However, Iran's revolution is unique in that it was almost completely religious in nature. The dominant ideology was religion, whereas revolutions in Russia and China revolved around communism. Although the Catholic Church was very much involved in the revolutionary era, early 20th century in Mexico, the Church did not direct the military, and the PRI quickly sidelined the Church once the party gained control of the country. In Iran, the dominant ideology was Shiism, and the most important revolutionary leader was a cleric, who in turn ruled Iran for 10 years following the revolution. Perhaps most significantly, Iran's revolution resulted in the establishment of a theocracy, while other revolutions often tried to break religious control of the government. The Shah's behavior disturbed Iranians largely because, from many people's points of view, he overstepped the bounds of the political culture in three ways. First, he was perceived as being totalitarian, not just authoritarian, as Shahs before the Pahlavis had been. But unlike Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, the Shah set about to create a patrimonial state, with patron clientelism in place, but without any real input from interest groups. As a result, true corporatism did not develop. He broke the balance between the secular and the religious state by secularizing Iran too much too fast, certainly from the point of view of the clergy. His ties to the West, particularly the United States, offended Iranian nationalists as well as the clergy. In many ways, the Shah created a divide in the political culture, with one side supporting modernization, in the sense of establishing a closer ties to the West, and the other side staunchly defending traditional ways, in particularly Shiism. A clerical elite rose to oppose the Shah, lead a revolution, and eventually take over the government. One more ingredient for the success of the revolution was the charisma of its leader, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He not only defended Islamic fundamentalism, which emphasized literal interpretation of Islamic texts, social conservatism, and political traditionalism, but he also articulated resentments toward the elite and the United States. His depictions of the United States as the Great Satan puzzled many Americans, but resonated with many frustrated people in Iran. The Ayatollah gave new meaning to the old Shia term, juris guardianship. The principle originally gave the senior clergy, including himself, broad authority over the unfortunate people, widows, orphans, mentally unstable, in society. But Khomeini claimed that the true meaning of the jurist guardianship gives the clergy authority over the entire Shia community. The revolution begins. Revolutions generally need a spark to begin the crisis. Although discontent had been building for a long time, two factors brought the situation to explode in revolution. Oil prices decreased by about 10% in the late 1970s. At the same time, the consumer prices increased by about 20% in Iran. According to the theory of revolution of rising expectations, revolutions are most likely to occur when people are doing better than they once were. But some time of setback happens. Iran fits the classic model in the early days of 1979. The United States puts pressure on the Shah to loosen his restraints on the opposition. President Jimmy Carter was a big promoter of human rights around the globe, and the Shah's tight control on Iranian civil society was worrisome to his administration. However, in this situation, when the Shah let his opponents speak, it encouraged others to voice their frustrations. Once the reins loosened, many groups supported the revolution. Political parties, labor organizations, professional associations, bazaar, merchant guilds, college students, and oil workers. In late 1978, hundreds of unarmed demonstrators were killed in a central square in Tehran, and oil workers had gone on strike, paralyzing the oil industry. Anti-regime rallies were attracting as many as 2 million protesters. It is important to note that the rallies were organized and led by clerics, but were broadly supported by people from many sectors of society. Although Khomeini was in exile in Paris, audio tapes of his speeches were passed out freely at the rallies, where people called for the abolition of the monarchy. The Shah fled the country at the beginning of February 1979, and his government officially ended in February 11th, with a famous announcement from the national television radio station quoted at the beginning of this chapter. The founding of the Islamic Republic. In late April 1979, a national referendum was held, and the Iranian people officially voted out the monarchy and established the Islamic Republic in its place. A constitution was drawn up late in the year by the Assembly of Religious Experts, a 73-man assembly of clerics directly elected by the people. The constitution gave broad authority to Khomeini and the clergy, although Prime Minister Mehdi Bazargan strongly objected. Bazargan advocated a presidential republic based on Islam, but democratic in structure. However, Khomeini's constitution was presented to the people in the midst of the U.S. hostage crisis, a time of high hostility toward Americans. The result was not surprising. 99% of the electorate endorsed it, even though only 75% of eligible voters actually voted. Once the constitution was endorsed, the Shia leaders launched the Cultural Revolution with goals that were very similar to Mao Zedong's goals as he led China's Cultural Revolution in 1966. The Cultural Revolution in Iran aimed to purify the country from not only the Shah's regime, but also from secular values and behaviors, particularly those with Western origins. The universities were cleared of liberals and staff with faculty who supported the new regime. The new government suppressed all opposition, including almost all groups from civil society, and many were executed in the name of revolutionary justice. Post-Khomeini, 1989 to the present. Until the Ayatollah Khomeini's death in 1989, the clerics consolidated and built their power. Their success was cemented by several important factors that brought them popular support. World petroleum prices rebounded, so Iran's economy improved accordingly. The government was able to afford social programs for the people, such as modern improvements for housing and medical clinics. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran in 1980, beginning the war between the two countries that continued throughout the decade. The people rallied around the government in response to this threat. And the charisma of Khomeini remained strong, and the power of his presence inspired faith in the government. Khomeini's death in 1989 marked the beginning of a new era for the Republic. His successor, Ali Khamenei, does not have the same magnetism of personality, nor does he have the academic credentials that Khomeini had, facts that have encouraged some scholars in Qum to question the legitimacy of the theocracy. The Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988, and world oil prices fell again during the 1990s. Most importantly, many in the population began to criticize the authoritarian rule of the clerics and to advocate a more democratic government. In many ways, the conflict between theocratic and democratic values has played itself out during the presidencies of Mohammad Khatami, 1997 to 2005, and Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, 2005 to the present. Khatami was a reformer who aimed to end the freeze in relations between Iran and the West, particularly the United States. He believed in a dialogue among civilizations that fostered positive relationships with other countries, and not just a cessation of hostilities, although he never advocated changing theocratic political structures. Reformers became a strong presence in both the Majlis and the executive branch. In contrast, Ahmadinejad is a conservative who has antagonized Western countries, although he has not isolated himself from them. He has asserted theocratic values and has appealed to Iranian nationalism to solidify his white, bloodless coup of the reformists.